Welcome to the Made for Agriculture podcast with Adam, Cameron, and Emily. Today's hosts are Adam Jones and Cameron Horine.
All right, folks, welcome to another episode of the Made for Agriculture podcast. My name is Adam Jones.
And I'm Cameron Horine.
And we're back today with our crack team of fertilizer experts, is what we'll call them. So, folks, what we wanted to do today, and I think this fits in really, really nicely. I hope that you listened to the last episode that we dropped on the Made for Agriculture feed, which was Emily talking to Jim Garilio with Midwest Labs about soil testing in the fall, which is when we do the bulk of our soil testing. Honestly, they talked a little bit about just soil testing in general. What they were testing, methods, some of those things that just kind of go into a soil test. And I think that's a great place to kind of start your understanding of what's going on out there. But a lot of folks have been doing it for a long time. But we wanted to cover really today was some just kind of a quick update on the fertilizer market. And then once we've got those soil tests and we understand the methods, we understand the data that we're looking at, what are we going to do with that, right? How are we going to put that into action for the 2025 crop year? So it's really what we wanted to cover today. I think we've got some great guests on the horn with us today to get through that. So I'll let those guys introduce themselves. So Colin, why don't you start?
My name's Colin Kraft. I'm a retail precision manager in District 7 and District 8 within MFA. So Southeast Kansas and Southwest Missouri. Working with precision specialists in our company to deliver a fertility program to our growers.
Awesome. Thanks, Colin. Tyler?
My name is Tyler Francis. I'm the Plant Foods Procurement Manager. I work out of the Columbia home office, and I pretty well buy most all of the NPK fertilizers for the company and keep track of that position.
Excellent. Thanks for being on here, Tyler. Jared?
Jared Harding, retail precision manager for Retail North, so kind of the northern third of Missouri and southern Iowa, kind of doing the same thing as Colin, work with precision specialists and growers, developing fertility plans and things of that nature.
Excellent. Well, there's two things in common, I would say, with those fertility plans that we're working on with growers. Number one, most of them involve fertilizer applications. So let's go ahead and start there. I think where we want to go first is just kind of, Tyler, give us kind of a state of our current fertilizer market. I know the last few years have been, we'll even leave out the air quotes, volatile in the fertilizer space. We've kind of seen that. We've ridden the roller coaster. So kind of get us up to here and tell us where we're at.
So the biggest elephant in the room is obviously phosphates. The CBD duties that have been put in place have made things difficult to get imports coming into the United States. We don't have enough domestic production to support what we need after we take our exports out. So that's made things difficult. And then obviously most of that production is down in Florida. So we had a little bit of market firmness there in front of the hurricanes due to some weather threats, plant shutdowns, that kind of stuff. So that didn't help. But that premium's kind of come back out of the market the last 4 or 5 days. The hurricane impact wasn't as big as what they had thought it was going to be. So that's nice to see. I don't think it's really changed prices at the retail gate too much because most of that price action would have been product that was going to move December, January, more Q1 type pricing. So at least we don't have that on the table. Potash has been very flat for the whole year. Haven't seen a lot of movement on that. Potash is a relatively good value versus what price has been the last 4 or 5 years. Something they need to pay attention to. Nitrogen, ammonia, particularly ammonia season is getting ready to kick off. Most of the production guys have a really big book on, and they're looking forward to a decent season. That's going to be obviously weather driven. Depending on what that does, we may see some movement for spring on prices, and we may not. It's just going to depend on fall applications. Globally, nitrogen, we've seen a couple of tenders with India. You've got a lot of demand in Brazil. So that tends to kind of drive the global urea price. And that's going to kind of underpivot what spring urea is going to do for the U.S.
Yeah, so Tyler, let's go back to the phosphate market real quick. And you don't have to give us the full history lesson here, but you mentioned some of the imports versus what's being produced in Florida, and I assume that goes back to the whole Mosaic prevailing duties thing, correct?
Yep.
Yeah, so you want to kind of define that for folks that may not know the background. I know we kind of see these stories come across and read them and pay a whole really close attention to them. I would say that's probably not the case for most other folks.
Yeah, so Mosaic filed a countervailing duty suit with the U.S. government against imported phosphates. Mosaic feels like it's not competing on a fair playing field. They have to deal with a lot of environmental costs in the U.S., higher manufacturing costs, and the other parts of the globe that produce a lot of phosphates are subsidized fairly heavy by their governments because a lot of those are nationalized assets. And Mosaic feels like they're not on an even playing field. So they file this countervailing duties suit with the government, and now we've got a 5-year window of what these duties are going to be each year, and they're retroactive, which makes it hard for importers wanting to bring in product because they don't necessarily know how much that duty is going to be until after they brought that tonnage in here and it's already on the ground with the producer. That risk is hard for them to swallow. And just with the global phosphate market being tight, China hasn't exported phosphates for a couple of years now. That's made things difficult. Brazil's got a bigger demand. And most of those international companies, if they can get the same price going to Brazil that they could come into the U.S. without the duty problem, they're just going to send those tons to Brazil. And that just makes our market here domestically tighter.
Right. And I think that's a big change, correct, over the last 20-ish years, especially in the phosphate market. I guess if my memory serves me correctly, folks used to bring stuff here because we always paid nice, good, hard American cash for it, right? And also there just wasn't as much demand for it in other parts of the world, whereas now it seems like everybody's fighting over those tenders.
Yeah. Brazil has really ramped up their consumption of fertilizer in the last 15 to 20 years versus what we were used to prior to that.
Correct.
Like it or not, our fertilizers become a big global market between us and Brazil and India and China. There's a lot of demand out there that didn't used to be there that we have to fight for now.
Right. And I think that's why we haven't, like in the phosphate market, some of these other factors, like what you just mentioned, is why we haven't seen, the market depression or the price, for lack of a better term, the price coming back down, right? We saw those, kind of post-COVID highs there on some of these products, but the phosphates have not come back down like some of the other fertilizers have. And I think you did a great job explaining why, right? There's other things at play here rather than just the global grain market or a supply scenario.
Yeah.
So, and then nitrogen's a little bit, I guess, kind of the same way. Let's go into that one a little bit more. You mentioned the potassium scenario, the potash. A lot of that doesn't come from as far, right? A lot of it comes from Canada, if I'm not mistaken.
There's a lot of domestic or North American production of potash.
Right.
But from a global standpoint, we have a lot of potash capacity. There's probably more capacity there than what there is for demand. So potash is kind of the opposite side of the phosphates. There's some talk about the Belarusians maybe backing off production. I saw Josh mention that on his Twitter feed. I'm sure a lot of guys pay attention to him. but yeah, there's a lot of potash capacity out there. There's more potash capacity coming online. So that potassium piece is relatively cheap based on an ROI versus where the grain market's at.
Right.
And I look for it to stay that way. I don't see any
Yeah.
major volatilities in that, at least for this season.
Yeah, it definitely seems to be has stabilized a lot more than everything else has. On the nitrogen market side of things, I think you hear that. I will say the number one thing you hear with the nitrogen market is it's tied to the corn price, right? So, how about I phrase the question this way? You tell me why that's right or not right.
I think the nitrogen market is tied to the best economical netback that the nitrogen producers can get out of their product. Whether that's, we go back a couple years and we had the gas problem in Europe with the Russian-Ukraine war, and let's just face it, natural gas was worth more to the Europeans than it was for domestic U.S. Nitrogen production. We exported the nitrogen or the natural gas out.
Right.
It's not always going to be tied to the corn market. If corn's the driving economic factor in that space versus everything else, then yes, it's going to be pointed at that. If you got $7 or $8 corn and corn wants to pay more for nitrogen than the industrial complex does, yeah, that's going to be your pivot factor. But those producers are just like anybody else in the market space. They want the best value out of their product that they can get, regardless of what they need to send it to. So.
Yeah, and you've got a global market there too, right? I mean, they're not stuck just selling nitrogen to the American corn farmer. There's other things they can do with it.
Correct. So. Some of the producers are able to export ammonia out. If they can't do ammonia, they'll turn around and upgrade it to urea or UAN, and they'll send it to the European market or the Brazilian market if they're willing to pay a bigger premium than what the U.S. market wants to consume.
Right. Absolutely. No, it's a great description. I appreciate that, Tyler. Like I said, that's just kind of wanted to throw it out there. I mean, that is what you hear on the street pretty much nonstop. And I guess in defense of rumors, right? Maybe that was the case at one point in time, but it certainly doesn't seem to be that way anymore. So, Jared, Colin, Cameron, you guys got any other comments kind of on the fertilizer market piece before we kind of transition into what to do with those products and how we want to place those products and kind of how to make a plan for next year?
I don't know if it really has an effect on the fertilizer market. I was just going to touch on our volumes and supply were, a lot of that comes on barges up the rivers, and as dry as we were having issues getting barge traffic on the rivers because of that. And so I do think that has improved as we've got rains and stuff, but that has had an impact on some fertilizer up until this point, and Tyler maybe I'll touch on that a little bit more, but again, I don't know that it really has an impact on the actual market of it though.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point, Cameron. I mean, from a logistics standpoint, we've had some issues on the barge traffic side of things. We've had draft restrictions on the lower and coming up into some spots. Our biggest issue for us has been in our Crothersville area. We haven't had any water hardly at all this fall to even get barges to the dock, which has kind of forced us to kind of make other plans and push some stuff around. And we're not the only company dealing with that kind of stuff. Most people don't realize how much movement it takes to get that ton of fertilizer to the farm. Most of them just think they walk into the retail store and they just pick it up when they want to. And it's not the case. When we're trying to make logistics planning for our movement, a lot of times we've got to make those plans, those decisions 40, 60, 90 days ahead of when we need that product placed at the retail level. So it takes a lot lot of forethought and forecasting to try to get stuff in place at the right time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And if you've got increased cost, right? Because that's really what you're talking about. If you've got a draft restriction for a barge car, you just can't put as much on there, which means your cost of freight is higher, right? That
Yep.
just gets passed along, right? In the fertilizer pricing thing. So it does seem like there's maybe a little bit of a light at the end of the tunnel on the river side of things. It looks like most of the Midwest got a kind of nice precipitation event here, and honestly looks to keep that trend a little bit. So no, that's a great point, Cameron. Anything else, guys, before we kind of move on?
I really don't have anything. I tend to let Tyler and those guys handle the market side of things.
Yeah, and that's a good point, Jared, right? Like, it's not something that we have direct control over. I mentioned, riding the roller coaster earlier, like through kind of the COVID stuff, and it's just, yeah, I mean, it goes on in the background. I mean, we have to deal with the consequences of it, but there's not much you can do about it, especially at this point in time when it is such a global market. And what they decide to do in Brazil or what they decide to tender in India and those kind of things have a very direct effect on the price that we can give to a grower. It's just something we got to deal with. So it's a good point. All right, guys. So going into 2025, I think there's a lot of folks that we've got a lot of employees, we've got a lot of contractors out in the field pulling soil samples right now. Not kind of talking about necessarily like what we're testing for or everything, but what's our goal? How do we kind of set that system up? So I'm going to pick on Colin first and have him kind of tell us from a fertility planning scenario, right? We know there's soil testing involved. What are we typically rolling into action to try to start fertility planning for next year?
Yeah, so obviously at the beginning of it, we got to figure out what crops are going to be growing in that coming year.
Sure.
We want to figure out the cropping plan and the rotation, or the oscillation, from Adam would like to call it. But so from that, if we have those soil points pulled and we get those results back, we sit down with that grower and we want to make sure we're fixing the right things first. Let's get the best value out of that sampling from the start. So let's look into correcting that pH, adjusting it to the places we want to adjust it to, for corn and beans, wheat, whatever have you, cool season grass, alfalfa. So let's get the value out of that foundation of fertility first, and then let's look into the phosphorus and the potassium side of things. So that can all be set up within that first cropping plan, figuring out the needs, the closest rock quarry to get that pH adjustment, or that lime, ag lime or dolomitic. And then going into how much corn are we going to run? How much beans are we going to run? With the fertilizer markets the way they are, some guys may be on a tighter plan, especially in my area. We're looking at like a 3 or 4 year drought now. So we want to make sure we base our recommendations correctly and agronomically for the benefit of that grower, but also keep their needs in mind and make sure we can tailor that system to them. Fertility was never killed overnight, and it's not going to be fixed overnight. So we definitely want to make a long-term plan with those guys and let them know that we're with them, and we're going to do the best for them and their acres.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I knew you were going to go there at some point. And that's the thing with a lot of these farms, whether it's you pick up a farm or purchase a farm or choose to soil sample for the first time in 20 years or whatever, whatever condition you find that piece of ground to be in, likely took decades and decades, and changes in crop rotation and changes in yield structure and because of changes in genetics and all those kind of things to get it into the condition that you're finding it, and trying to take something that has been under fertilized or not paid attention to since 1987 and fixing that in 1 year is just not a very feasible thing to do, right? And that's the number one thing I would say is for folks just to not get overwhelmed by that. The greatest thing you can do is pay attention and have a plan moving forward on how you're going to address things, and how addressing those things is going to help your crop production moving forward off of that farm, and just take it kind of step by step, right? That's a great point. Great point. So, what are you guys typically like? What's the number one thing that you guys typically find, right? You look at all sorts of precision field maps that are produced based on soil sampling data. I know you guys are in different geographies, so maybe you have a different answer to this question, but what's the number one thing that typically jumps off the page at you the first time that you pull those nutrient surfaces from that soil sampling?
I'd say up in my area, it's usually our phosphate levels. And it kind of varies too, depending on, what field we're reading those samples, interpreting the samples from. You can about take it to the bank. If it's forages, the phosphates are going to be in the tank. I joke that they put 1 on a phosphate soil test just because they don't want to put 0 and offend somebody. But yeah, phosphates on our forages is always typically in the single digits, and on the row crops it's typically a little bit better. But I think overall, phosphate in my neck of the woods typically is what is going to be the lowest on the soil test. The rest of them, you can have some outliers from a potassium standpoint and pH, but for the most part, those are pretty variable, and not usually as bad as our phosphates.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'll add to that point, and maybe it's just like Adam said, if it's the first time somebody's soil sampled or actually really looked into a grid sample, just from crop history of what they've pulled, genetics are getting better. Maybe rain was perfect that year. They're pulling more nutrients than they believe they were doing, but they've been putting out a 9-23-30 blend. So if you're running something like beans that are going to take more potassium than what you've given it, then we're going to start seeing those numbers go back. It really depends on that crop rotation, how they've been handling that, how they understand what pulls more phosphate than potassium, and, kind of tailoring that plan with them. So I'm agreeing with Jared on the low phosphorus in grass acres for sure. I think when you get to a grass aspect or a crop, we're always going to keep the nitrogen there and maybe push some potassium out there too. But phosphate being one of the higher priced products, maybe that gets cut back a little bit. So
yeah. Oh, and I wonder sometimes too, guys, on the phosphate levels. We've been doing corn production, wheat production for 120 years on some of this ground at this point. But how long have we really had those heavy soybean crop rotations? I mean, to you young whippersnappers like Colin here, your entire life, right? But to those of us that remember other crop rotations, Jared, I see the gray in your facial hair there. To those of us that remember other crop rotations, right? Missouri wasn't always like 2/3 soybeans. It just, the crop rotation was not always that way, and so we got to think about historic removals, and we've really upped the the potassium removal off of some of this ground, but we're really kind of tapping into probably what was there historically still, honestly. So no, that's good stuff. I appreciate that. There's always something. I know I've looked at enough soil results and things that there's always something that jumps off the page at you that you're like, oh my gosh, if I'm going to spend $1, it's going to be right here. It seems like there's always on every analysis there's something that you can just look at the soil test and you just know that is yield limiting. We need to do something about that. So you mentioned, I think it's a good point. Let's go back into Jared. You mentioned those kind of the single digit phosphorus levels, right? And we mentioned being overwhelmed and kind of planning. So walk me through kind of what you do, because if you take something that's got a single digit phosphorus test and run it on a 220 bushel corn yield goal and say that we're going to build that back in 2 or 3 or 4 years, that's going to produce one whale of a fertilizer wreck, right? And something that may not work in somebody's budget. So kind of walk me through kind of how you sit down and plan with somebody to kind of go through that, right? We know what the issue is, we know what the solution is, but how do we get from A to B?
Right. So usually whenever I first sit down with a producer after we get results back, I like to try and establish a goal with them, get them to let me know what are your goals here. Is your goals, is it to get your fertility up to optimum? Is it to just raise the most amount of bushels you possibly can and really throw a bunch at it to win some contests? Kind of get an idea of what their goals are, so I kind of know where to start on the process of writing the recommendations. And for me, typically, and I'm not sure, I assume Colin's probably the same, but I'll warn anybody that may be listening to this at some point, if they work with me, I don't sugarcoat the first rec. I'm going to bring the rec that is what you need based on what you tell me for yield goals and things like that. Because I don't want to be the one in 4 years when we resample, if we don't see the results, be the one that cut them or on your behalf. So that first rec is going to be the full meal ticket to hopefully, there's a lot of things we can't control, but with what we can, it's going to be the full shot to achieve those goals that we establish. And then from there, we go over them, kind of figure out, do we need to tweak them based on maybe they're not comfortable with that amount going out. It's just more than they're used to. That happens from time to time, because I think a lot of times I see maybe people don't think about the removal rates or how much, or maybe even don't know how much a bushel of corn or beans removes from the soil. So it can be a little overwhelming from that standpoint. And that's before you even get to the dollar and cents. So then we kind of start working backwards. So I kind of start at the top and work my way backwards, because ultimately my goal is to achieve hopefully help them achieve their goals, and increase their yields and profitability, hopefully, and all while spending their money as efficiently as we possibly can. So.
Absolutely. Colin, do you do anything different than what Jared said, or got anything to add there?
I'm same as Jared. I want him to see the full sticker price up front, 100%.
Sure.
This is gung ho. And then work backwards from the same. So maybe that's breaking down to a certain price to the acre on phosphates and potassiums. It's looking at every field and realizing that we used to have an old hog lot there or something on that soil map that I can see in the results, and we can talk about that with the grower and to see, we really don't need to put stuff here. That's what the variable rate's going to do for you in that aspect. But we've got a very low phosphorus point or in this corner of the field. Let's direct our money towards that. If it comes back to, I only spend $75 an acre, we're still going to tailor those recs, on the variable rate scale, but we're going to make sure that we're staying within that checking account or, that price to the acre budget. So I'll never sell the program to a grower even before we soil sample, as we're just going to save money doing this. I'm never going to sell a program like that, because there are some big sticker prices out there once we look at those levels and try to reach those goals. But we're going to put the money in the right spot to make sure we keep a plan going for that guy, but also the kid working for him and grandkid later. So.
Absolutely. Just making kind of purposeful, thought out decisions on what we're doing with it. And honestly, I kind of like that scenario that you just laid out there, where you may have a farm that you want to throw extra at, right? Like, hey, we just picked up this piece. I've got my fertility fixed on a lot of my acres, so we're just kind of running more of a maintenance schedule here. So I can take some of this fertility budget, right, and move it over to this piece, and we can really kind of focus in on and address some issues here, right? So it's always good to kind of lead with that. It's like, hey, here's what we recommend. And then obviously there's the other part of that where you have a large chunk of acres that call for a lot of product, and it just may not work in the budget. But like you said, that's a great point. I encourage folks to just be open and honest with us, like on what. Like, hey, what's your budget? Tell me what you kind of have earmarked. What works for your operation to spend on this acre? And that way I can tell you, or you can, you and Jared can tell them, okay, if you've got $85. Here's where we need to spend it, right? This is what's going to return on that money. Let's not just take $85 and figure out an 40, 60 or whatever it's going to be and kick it out there everywhere. But let's take your $85 and really kind of focus it in on where we know we're going to get return on investment. Because you guys can look at those maps and if you're in the low or very low categories. I mean, we've kind of all seen those return to fertilizer graphs, right? That is where you're going to get your money back.
Yep.
And even to saying, go ahead, Cameron.
Well, I was just say, I think you hit the nail on the head, Adam, is especially at the point where farm gate profitability is down, as we know that.
Sure.
Having a fertility plan to where we can utilize soil test data and yield data, removals from that standpoint, it allows us to be better at putting together a fertility plan of saying, hey, I only have this much of a budget. And so instead of just taking the $85 and throwing out a 30-30 or whatever you've done for the last 15, 20 years, because that's what your dad did or your grandpa did, we can utilize the tools that we have. And like you said, be able to make a bigger impact on our profitability by saying, hey, these are hot spots, or these are spots that even if we throw this out, we're not going to be able to make an advancement on. So let's utilize our budget to our fullest potential and fix the important parts of our field. So yeah.
Yeah, and during times of depressed grain prices, right? This would make your economics 101's professor's head explode, right? But the worst thing that you can do is raise less grain when the price is low. Like it's a basic concept, and like I said, I know it goes, kind of contrary to economics, but the reality is if the price is low, you need big yields to cover your total dollars per acre to cover your inputs. A lot of these input costs are fixed, right? Your landlord that you're paying a bunch of money in cash rent to doesn't care whether you raise 30 bushel beans or 75 bushel beans. But I can tell you that you care, because the 75 bushel beans are going to pencil a heck of a lot better because you still got to pay the exact same amount of cash rent, right? So it's just a matter of kind of how we set those expectations and kind of set up that budget moving forward. I think that's kind of a bit of a good kind of transition into some of that expectation setting, right? Because we would all like to throw our farm out there and say that, yep, crop insurance guy, we're going to shoot for a 235 bushel corn APH here on this farm, and but our phosphorus levels are 2 all the way across it, right? So how many years out of 10 are we going to get 235 bushel to make that APH? So I think there's something to be said there for kind of setting some of those expectations. So longer term, guys, I know you guys have worked, we kind of set up and had a good discussion there on what you guys do with kind of a new fertility acre, right? What are some of the other things that you're doing to manage that acre long term, right? I know you guys both have acres that you've worked with for probably decades at this point. The same acre, right? How are we managing those acres, and what are we seeing in those subsequent soil tests? How are we tweaking management? How have you seen that management tweaked long term?
Yeah, I would say, your stage 1 guys, which would be basically a soil test going into a yield goal and then a build process. Those are the newest guys, but the guys have been working through those stage 1s, building their levels to optimum, and now are sitting in a spot where we can start looking more into removal, or maybe we've built optimum to P and K or those levels, and we can start looking into removal only. So it really is kind of the longer term guys. Like you said, we've been working on some acres for 10 plus years now. They've built really good levels in their soils. They're making consistent crops when they get rain and as genetics get bigger and fungicides, everything of that aspect. But maybe it's looking into taking some years off, not necessarily not spreading any fertilizer at all, but let's use last year's yield data. Maybe they grew some beans that made 55 bushel. We're going to take that calibrated yield map of good data, flip it, and then make a variable rate fertilizer rec to that point with no build in it at all. So we're not essentially taking from the ground what we took the year before in harvest, but we're going to replace it back to the field to our optimum levels. We've got several guys that do that on leased ground. They want to do the best thing they can for that ground, but they don't want to put a bunch of fertility into it and build, and then it gets taken out in 2 years and they kind of just spent money for somebody else to benefit from it. So a lot of those older acres, if that farmer has the data to use, we are pushing those stage 2 and then even to a stage 3 recommendation where we're not going to put a ton of stuff out there. And I'm in a 170 bushel corn environment. I'm not king corn up there in north central, northeast like Jared, but that's kind of how we tailor those recommendations when we get to that point in those soil tests. And I think it's known we're testing every 4 years on that, or maybe even every 3. So we're keeping accurate data as we go through and setting our parameters from that data.
Yeah. Jared?
Yeah. So the acres that I've worked with, for, as you said, decades now, not that long, but have been working with and went through a few different, soil sample rounds of soil sampling, if you will. Definitely work to incorporate yield data into that grower's operation as fast as feasibly possible. Sometimes that entails actually making a purchase of a, technology for the combine, or they update combines and get kind of at that point where they are collecting good calibrated yield data. So I try and start incorporating that as soon as I possibly can. Sorry, forage guys, we don't have that yet. But start trying to incorporate that, and then we can get creative with that yield data. So obviously, like Colin kind of alluded to, we've got a few different tiers on our NutriTrack program there. Obviously, kind of our most accurate, in my opinion, is what he was referencing, stage 2. So we're overlaying the yield layer for the removal portion of our RECs, and then the build is coming from the soil sample points. Once we get up to the point where the grower's content with where his fertility levels are, everything's maybe at optimum or pretty darn close to it, we can roll into some of that removal only, just kind of maintenance stuff with the yield data. But again, it kind of goes back to whatever the grower's goals are. At that point, when we've been working with some of these guys for as long as we have on this, they see the benefit of good fertility, and it is raising their yields. So we've taken some approaches where we start to actually try and figure out how to push some of those yields, maybe push certain spots in that field. We look kind of deeper, kind of segmenting areas of that field out as higher producing, maybe seeing if we can try and push some of those. And a lot of that revolves around utilizing good yield data. More data, the better. But we can get pretty creative with some of the different recommendations that we can kick out using that yield data. We do. So it kind of just depends, like I said, on what the grower's goals are when we get to that point.
Sure. Well, most folks are collecting. I mean, that's kind of you kind of did a great job there of going into how we're utilizing some of that yield data. Most folks are collecting that, right? Because they're either giving it to the crop insurance guy or using it to choose a seed hybrid or something like that. And it's all wonderful. I mean, it's a good use of data and what you bought the equipment to get the data for. But to your point, are you using your data to continue to really push your yields forward? And that's what you're talking about doing there, right? I mean, it's not just saying that, hey, this product was better than this product, or hey, crop insurance guy, here's my data for the year, so I'm not cheating this system or whatever, whatever it is. But you're really saying, okay, what parts of this field can I push? Because we all know those spots, right? I mean, as you're looking at your yield data, as you're in the combine going across the field, you've always got that one piece of the ground. They're like, man, I wish the whole darn farm would be just like this spot. Sorry, we sometimes can improve other parts of the farm, but we can't always make it all exactly like that one good spot, right? But we can push that good spot another 20, 30 bushel higher. That makes a big difference, when you start talking farm averages. So yeah, that's a great point.
For sure. Yeah, I kind of when I started doing this, and think in terms of on the equipment side of things, you think about point row clutches and things like that. But as I've gotten gray and wiser, I really think that the yield monitor with the data collecting, as long as you're collecting good yield data, is potentially even more valuable than your point row clutches and things like that. So it's that data is very valuable stuff to an operation, and obviously
Absolutely.
making sure it's good calibrated. So,
is there anything else creative that you guys are doing? We could talk about this like literally all day, so I'm going to try to not do that. But is there anything else kind of creative or any other kind of planning points or kind of points that you always point out to a grower when you're sitting down with them? Anything like that we didn't go over that you guys want to make sure that you kind of cover?
Yeah, I mean, as Jared said, once we get a lot of that or more data, better data, the better, I guess, or good data, the better, over history of that farmer's field, we can start to analyze that data a little bit different, maybe putting into a spatial trend model. So bushels are going up on this field, or if things are getting better and better, but we always see that one spot, like you said, Adam, that we wish the whole farm was that spot. It's always making 130% of average. But you also have the spots that are washouts. They're low ends of the field. They hold water or they get rid of water too quickly. Maybe they only make 60% of your average. So we can take that good calibrated yield data and essentially make a spatial trend of it, and work into some different aspects of that operation. Maybe that turns into a variable rate yield goal. It turns into a variable rate seeding recommendation for their planter if they have the ability to do it. But also we can take a little bit step further in that and go into side dress nitrogen for a corn crop. I guess I won't steal all the thunder. Jared can talk a little bit about it on NutriTrack but there are some things we can do if we get some good calibrated yield data, and the more of it, the better.
I think one thing that's worth mentioning, if anybody's listening to this and hasn't jumped into doing any soil testing, grid soil sampling, I usually tell producers, if they get real excited about doing it and they want to go just whole hog and sample the whole thing, just know if you've not done it and you don't know where you're at fertility wise, it's good to maybe, section those acres up, do a fourth type of deal. Because there is some sticker shock there. I've worked with a lot of different growers that have bit off a little more than they, I don't know if more than they could chew is the way to say it, but more than they would really wanted to try and tackle. So, be realistic about it, especially if you have no idea of where you're at fertility wise, and come into it from that aspect, and try and make it as less painful as possible. But that would definitely help.
Absolutely. No, that's a good point, because it can, if you're used to one farm budget and you can kind of open somebody's eyes to a whole new budget scenario there, and if you're not able to do something about the issues that you find out there, right? There's not as much value in finding them. So make sure that you can address whatever acres that you're ready to sample. So that's a good call out. What else, guys? I mean, Colin, you kind of alluded to using some of those creating some of those yield zones, those long-term average yield zones, and kind of variable rating some of the nitrogen side of things. I know that's hard to do, or a little more complicated to do sometimes these days on initial applications, but we can certainly do it with side dress, and I think that makes a lot of sense as far as areas that we can continue. Some of those areas that we want to push, right? We've discussed using doing it with some of our P and K recs, but also nitrogen. So.
Yeah, I mean, we use a model through our fertility program called NutriTrack. Essentially, it's a nitrogen management tool. So following more so a 1-to-1 ratio, or maybe a 1.1 pounds of nitrogen to 1 bushel of corn ratio, we want to make sure we're feeding our crop at the exact time it needs it, but also we're not leaving anything on the table as far as bushels. but also being mindful of the conditions we're growing our corn in that year. So the last 2 years in my region, 2 years ago, we planted corn around the 1st of April. By the time the corn got 36 inches tall or knee top high, we had 6 inches of rain. So some of that initial nitrogen that we put out in that field wasn't necessarily lost or to be expected to be lost. This last year, we had 16 inches of rain in that same time frame. So the year is going to vary differently every year. Growers know that. We all know that on what our Mother Nature gives us. So when using that nitrogen management tool, we basically put all the inputs in we can. The more data, the better. From when they planted that corn crop, what population, what yield goal they're wanting to set for themselves, any nitrogen applications up to that point. And this model will start to chew on that information and predict when we need to get out there and start feeding that crop at that V6 to V8 time range. So using that spatial trend data, plus our soil sampling, the initial start to the fertility program, we can add that data in and actually variable rate Super U or treated urea over the top of the corn. I won't say untreated urea in that recommendation because it needs to be treated, but we can just use that stuff to kind of the max of its ability to utilize every acre on the farm to the best it can do. So that's kind of the portion on the nitrogen tool. The other portion would be the variable rate planting, and that's finding those best spots and pushing those populations. And even the worst spots, maybe hanging back on populations. Let's not put as much input into those areas as we need to do. So maybe hang it back to 23,000 around the edge of the trees and where the deer always seem to come in and everything of that nature. And then the spot that makes 140% of average, let's push it a little bit and get to 35 or 36,000.
For sure. Yeah, there's just so much. When you start paying attention to things, that's kind of what makes it fun. There's just so much you can do with some of that stuff, data wise, and pushing different aspects. So it's a good call out. Guys, I don't want to make this super long, so I think we'll end there. I very much appreciate all you guys taking time at the end of the day here to jump on here and record this. These are always other things, other duties as required, right? And certainly appreciate your all's insights. So Colin, Tyler, Jared, thank you so much for taking time to come on here and talk to folks. These are your normal MFA guys, right? That you'll see hanging out at stores and working with customers. So these we won't let it go to their head. They're not celebrities. They're folks that anybody can go in and work with, right? And great examples. So we very much appreciate it. So Tyler, thanks for the implications of market and kind of some of that market analysis. We appreciate that too. We expect you to get back to work, right? These guys can go home. You have to go back to work and try to find us some cheaper fertilizer.
You bet. I'll flip over every rock I can find, guys.
Sounds good. We appreciate it. We understand the importance of what you're up to, and thanks for your time as well. So if with nothing else, we'll jump off of here and talk to you next episode. Thank you. We should be good. Just as a heads up, Jared Harding, typically he puts the video out of this recording on YouTube as well. So if you do weird things with your hands.
Thank you for listening to the Made for Agriculture podcast, brought to you by MFA, your whole farm solution.